the sort of mass market limelight. I guess I'm particularly interested in the audience that was going to that have been going to movies like Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Let me ask you first, is that science fiction or not?
Well, it's a kind of science fiction. It's very heavily into special effects, which in books we don't have to worry about. We just use words and allow the reader's mind to create the special effects.
Do you think that those viewers, though, who were going to the movies, a lot of young kids, were then coming out of the movies, going into bookstores and buying books like yours?
Oh, if they did, I'd have sold tens, maybe hundreds of millions of copies, and I'd have been a runaway bestseller like you never saw. I would think that perhaps 1 out of 1,000 or less, maybe, would be sufficiently interested to buy books, but that's enough. That's enough.
Again, using those movies, which most of our viewers have seen, what is it about those movies and the extent to which they're science fiction that you think lures so many people, creates such an enormous has such enormous popular appeal?
Oh, I think it's the same thing as interests people in circuses. You see people doing things that are very unusual that you would swear couldn't be done. In the movies, naturally, they have all kinds of camera trickery so that you can see people apparently fly or perform feats of strength and so on. And it doesn't have to be science fiction. It could be a horror movie. It could be an adventure movie.
There's a parallel between these, everything from romance fiction to fantasy fiction to science fiction, which is escapism and the notion of a better world than we actually live in. Is that part of the lure?
Well, a different world. I don't know that it's necessarily a better world. Many science fiction movies portray nightmares rather than pleasant dreams.
The common thought, though, is that science fiction is fundamentally, writers of science fiction are fundamentally optimistic, seeing the possibility of, as I say, of a better world. Yes or no?
Well, writers like myself and Arthur C. Clarke are optimistic. But there are a great many writers who are pessimistic and who portray dystopias. That's the opposite of a utopia, where everything is bad. The most famous dystopia written in recent years was, of course, 1984, which this year made a reappearance on the bestseller list for a while.
Has the advance of technology, which science fiction writers were there to forecast for all these years, has its advance begun to outstrip the capacity of science fiction writers to keep pace with it?
Oh, no. No, that's not at all likely. As a matter of fact, when I first started writing science fiction, I wrote stories in which the technologies have still not yet been caught up with and probably won't ever be. As soon as you write a story that involves faster-than-light travel or time travel or a number of other things, robots that are as intelligent as human beings, then you're giving yourself a lot of leeway.
We're going to have to come back in just a minute, and when we do, we're going to be joined by another very, very famous and admired science fiction writer, Frederick Pohl, who was also at one time Isaac Asimov's literary agent. Hi, this is Now in Paperback. We're back talking about science fiction. Isaac Asimov, our guest, is joined now by Frederick Pohl, another author, and by comparison to Isaac Asimov, with only 140 books to his credit, a piker, almost. You two guys...
I wasted a lot of time as an editor.
I see. Now you're catching up. You two guys had very common backgrounds, or at least the same borough in which you grew up, Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, yes, garden spot of America.
Tell me, did that background have only a coincidental or actually some real relationship to, you think, the fact that both of you ended up pursuing so vociferously this field?
I think the fact that I grew up in Brooklyn, which is part of New York City, had a big effect because, first of all, Brooklyn had a marvelous library system. And everything I know in the world I learned by reading a book somewhere. And I started reading the library books when I was 10 or so. And also, when you get in a city, when you have a collection of people, you find that there are large numbers of people that share any interest you can imagine.
But this could
so
go
people like Isaac and I found each other as people who are interested in
But
science
that could
fiction.
go for any kind of writing and any kind of reading. I'm interested in the notion of science fiction. There's this common idea that...
I really don't know why you want to separate science fiction from writing.
Because that's our subject today.
But science fiction is a kind of writing, and science fiction is diverse, is as diverse as any other kind of writing. But what interests us is looking at the future. You know?
Which is the province of science fiction more than other forms of literature. I mean, is it partly, do you think, in response to your childhood, some desire to look... I'm not looking for a Freudian analysis.
There's
here.
a writer named Damon Knight who says that all science fiction writers began as toads. They weren't popular with their friends. They didn't get along with girls. They were driven on their own resources, and they had to read and therefore to write, which is how he says. Now, some of us at the age of 18 or so are kissed by a fairy princess, and they turn into what you see before you. And then there are people like Isaac.
So, did that description that you just gave go for the two of you, or go for you?
So. I think it did for me. I mean,
yeah, it went for me too. And of course, science fiction readers were in those days perhaps a smaller segment than other kind of readers, and we were more surprised and pleased when we found each other. We clung together tightly. And in fact, Fred and I met it when we were both 19. And no, 18. We were both 18 at the time. And by
I was
that
18. He was much older.
And by that time, we had independently become science fiction enthusiasts, and we're dreaming of writing ourselves.
Is part of it a kind of intrinsic interest in technology and science itself?
It's an interest in what happens to the world when it changes. Science fiction is a literature of change. It's about what would exist if some factors were changed. Technology is one of the factors. Society is another. An invasion by Martians is another.
Wait, let's talk a little bit about imagination. When you're writing, between you, 400 books over the course of your careers so far, what I'm wondering is, where do you have the time to sit and create universes, systems? Where do you and how do you go about thinking about future worlds?
Well, I look at the world around me, and I dissect it into its parts. And I take some of those parts out and throw them away and plug in some new ones, some sort of change. And then I try to see
Give
how
an
the machine...
example.
Well, in the novel that I think is right behind me, Hichi Rendezvous, the basic assumption is that the human race discovers some artifacts left by a long-vanished race of aliens. Okay, they find these things which are done by a technology that is wholly alien to human beings, but they have the use of them. Well, how does that affect the human race? How does it change the lives of individual human beings if they suddenly have spaceships that will take them somewhere in the universe? They don't know where until they get there, and maybe find something of great value, but they don't know that until they find it.
And dramatically, narratively, what the drama is of that book and of these, this is not the only one of the Hichi books, is the notion that you're in a game of great chance. I mean, that's the excitement, right? You may, in the end, have an enormous success, or you may be burned up in outer space. You may never return.
That's right. And you don't know until you get into the ship and find out, because you may indeed come back dead. But it's the same sort of thing in almost any science fiction novel. You take one change, you tell one big lie, and you see how that affects the rest of your life.
Isaac, let me ask you a question about, in terms of the construction of these books, how important is the moral component of it, the notion of good and evil? Is that a strain that you're thinking about when you write all the time, when you're writing science fiction, or not?
Well, mostly what I think of is that the reader is going to sympathize with one side or the other. And I want to make sure that the reader sympathizes with the one I want him to sympathize with. So I try to make that side sound the more reasonable and the more humane. When it comes to good and evil, I'm not sure I can tell them apart.
What about for you? Is that a concern? Is there a didactic quality to science fiction, to your own writing?
Yeah, of course. I mean, somebody said the proper title for any book is How to Be More Like Me. And I think that's particularly true of science fiction novels, because you write a story describing a world as you might like to have it or you might fear to have it. You try to describe how you would be in it, because nobody can write about anybody themselves. And I think all science fiction writers, and probably most writers, are preachers, essentially, and they want to convey a message. Preachers,
really. You know, in that context, let me just wind back very quickly to something you said before, which is the idea of starting with the seed of an idea and then creating, in effect, a universe or a world around it. How important is internal consistency? How important are the individual details of the world you're creating?
They're exactly as important in science fiction as they are in any other novel. If you make a mistake, if you do something stupid, if you say something that isn't true in a science fiction novel, you destroy your reader's faith in you. In a science fiction novel, it may be a scientific thing that you're saying wrong. But if you're writing a novel about London and you have the buses going on the right side of the street, you've destroyed your reader's faith in you. He isn't going to believe anything you say after that.
Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I wanted to say that science fiction readers are a lot more articulate than any other kind, and anytime you make any mistake, you hear from them ad infinitum.
In fact, I would suspect that there are a certain number of them who are in the business of looking for inconsistency.
Well, the ones who write to me invariably sound very gleeful. At last, I have caught you in an error.
Do you get a lot of letters like that?
Quite a few, yes. I make quite a few errors.
What's the most recent sizable error that you got taken to task for?
Oh, sometimes they're trivial, as when, for instance, I say said so-and-so, and I use the wrong name, obviously the wrong name. And then I get dozens of letters all pointing it out.
It's a rabid group.
I wrote a novel called Starburst, which was originally a novella called The Gold at the Starbow's End, in which I said something about a number which was too large for any computer to print out, required 3 or 4 computers working in tandem. I not only got 40 or 50 letters, but I got 6 people who actually wrote out that number on a computer tape and sent it to me.
Is there a relationship between, is it equally important to be concerned with the technological, to be concerned with the human aspects of the interactions in this universe as with the technological?
Depends on what you're writing about, but you really need to talk about everything. You want to talk about what human life is like. Technology affects us all very greatly today and will more in the future. So you can't talk about human life without talking about technology.
We have to take a break. We're going to be back in just a minute to talk a little further with Frederick Pohl and Isaac Asimov. We're back with Isaac Asimov and Frederick Pohl. Isaac, I wanted to ask you a question about science fiction writers as predictors of the future. Tend to be more accurate than other kinds of predictors or less accurate? How, for example, in comparison to Gene Dixon?
Well, now you're asking something simple. Science fiction writers are much more accurate than Gene Dixon or her ilk. That doesn't mean they're very good or that they predict correctly a large fraction of the time, because they don't. In an absolute sense, they're poor predictors. It's just that they're better than everybody else.
Also, that's not the business they're in, Tony. Somebody asked Ray Bradbury that once, and he said, I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm trying to prevent it.
That's wonderful. That's right. Well, that's along the lines of the didactic nature that we were talking about before. On the other hand, in the process of trying to prevent it, you predict certain things. I wonder to what extent...
But it's not a prediction. It's a what if. It's suppose this thing happened. It's not saying it's going to happen, but what if this happened?
As a matter of fact, we're terribly surprised if we sometimes hit something. 40 years ago, I started writing robot stories, and now robots are a fact. Still a lot simpler and more primitive than mine, but they're a fact. And I suddenly have blossomed into a kind of grandfather of the robots just because I made up stories.
Yeah, actually, a lot of people don't realize that you've written more nonfiction than fiction. Have you written nonfiction about robots at all?
Well, I'm busy working on a book on robots right now, but it's my first book on robots.
I think a lot of people wonder whether some of the things that you imagine and create are things that you yourself are actually interested in participating in. Now, for example, you create this notion of other worlds, and yet you yourself won't fly. Is that correct or true?
That's true, and as a matter of fact, I participate in almost nothing. When you sit around writing as many 20 books as a year, there's nothing you can participate in except sitting at the typewriter.
What about the treatment of women? Now, in Foundation's Edge, it's hard to say that she's a sympathetic character, but is it the mayor?
Yeah, the mayor.
The mayor is a woman.
Right.
That would come to those who have only a peripheral knowledge of science fiction as a little bit of a surprise, because women have generally been secondary characters in science fiction.
Well, they certainly have been secondary in my writing, because I started writing science fiction before I had ever had a date, so that women were a closed book to me at the start. However, I managed in The Robots of Dawn, my second bestseller, to insert a little honest-to-God realistic sex. And,
it only took you 291 books?
281 books.
281 books.
And even so, what sex I put in was completely germane to the plot, and I didn't go one step further than was necessary.
But what about the treatment of women? That is, are women beginning to achieve equality in science fiction as they are in society? Or
we're aware of feminism.
As a matter of fact, a lot of the best new writers are women, and they are carrying the banner for all the other women in the world. But this, too, it goes back to the fact that science fiction began in America in pulp magazines, where the emphasis was on adventure and action, and women were not supposed to be taking part in that. They were the creatures who were rescued by the hero from the monster or the alien
That's
or
right,
the
yeah.
peril, whatever it was. So that's just, those were the dynamics of science fiction writing in the 20s and 30s and even in the 40s.
What about humor? Again, if you go back historically, the notion was, although as far back as 1950, you were writing probably earlier, but I'm aware of the book, the satire about advertising, which is
Space
called
Merchants, yeah.
Space Merchants. But there is a notion.
Well, there is satirical humor in science fiction a lot, because that's one way of talking about the future, to make it reductio ad absurdum, so it's just so bad that it's funny. But there is not too much belly laugh humor.
Yuck it up.
No.
Why not?
Much, I don't know why not. Maybe Isaac does.
Well, for one thing, it's difficult to write humor, more difficult than most things. You can write suspense and get it pretty suspenseful, or you can put in a lot of love interest and get it pretty romantic. But there's no such thing as pretty funny. It's either on the nose or it's not funny at all.
I asked Isaac this before in a few minutes earlier, and that is, do you think that the rapid advance of technology has in some sense taken away some of your raw material, outstripped?
No, not a bit. You know, the rapid advance of technology just gives more things to write about and think about. The more that happens, the more there is to speculate about. The more human knowledge increases in any area, the more there is to learn.
What are you speculating about right now?
What I'm writing now is about, it's about cosmology. It's about the origins of the universe and where it's going. As a matter of fact, T.G. Rendezvous is about that, too. And no small subjects. It's like Elliot Rosewater said.
Yeah, I love that. That's right. Well, I wonder, actually, in that context, because there are some who felt that Vonnegut's apparent affection towards science fiction was, in fact, derisive. And I wonder if...
Kurt Vonnegut writes science fiction, always has, knows it, but pretends it's not because it gets to be sold more frequently in larger volume if he doesn't call it science
Well, I wonder if either of you
He began in the science fiction magazine.
I understand that. That's right. Although he's never been considered one of the great science fiction writers. What I'm wondering...
Yes, he has.
He has?
Yes, he has and is.
That's a perception of your own?
No, it's a perception of the people who read science fiction, who are aware that he's a science fiction writer.
What about just the notion of the critical acclaim accorded or not accorded to science fiction as a literary form? Are you sensitive about the absence of comparable acclaim given to science fiction?
No, I don't care. The science fiction audience is fairly limited. There aren't probably more than one reader out of 20 or 30 who is perceptive enough and agile enough to read science fiction. And
you mean you
there's
think
other people...
You think critics are behind the times?
Oh, definitely. Well, they always are, yes.
Well, besides, it's a matter of intelligence, too. Science fiction, good science fiction, is written for people with high IQs, and there are only so many people with high IQs out. Not enough to really make a mass market. Well, and it limits the critics, too. They have to have high IQs also.
Well, but then that runs against the current of what's been happening to science fiction. You pick up the bestseller lists, and there are 2 or 3 books every week.
Ah, well, in the first place, some of them are fantasies, some of them are horrors.
Your own book?
My own book is science fiction, but Robots of Dawn was on the New York Times bestseller list for 13 weeks, never got reviewed. But they have said to me even, that they routinely review every book on the bestseller list, regardless of its quality. But I guess I set a new low for quality or something.
What do you attribute the absence of critical attention to it?
Well, just that there is a literary establishment which pretends that science fiction is not writing, because, as Isaac says, they're not able to follow what's being said in science fiction.
I wonder, one quick last question, if it's a possibility that the fact that you guys produce so much works against you.
Oh, definitely.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Everybody assumes if you write fast, you can't be writing well.
Sure.
What they don't know is that we don't have time to do anything but write.
That's right. We're ill-rounded human beings. We write nothing else. But I'm sure that many of your reviewers says, oh, it's just another Asimov, and tosses it aside.
Let me ask you a question. How long do you, so that people will know now, how long do you spend on a piece of fiction, a novel? You've written 35 books or edited 35 books in the last 18 months, so you don't spend an enormous amount of time on any given one.
No, I don't. And a novel, I generally count on 7 months, but not a solid 7 months, because I take time out to write other things. But it takes me 7 months on the
Well, that leaves only about twice that for the other 35 books that you did.
I work well faster.
I mean, from morning until evening?
Yes. If people will leave me alone and not interrupt me, I'll spend 15 hours a day. But I'm always interrupted, like now, for instance.
Thanks very much for joining us, Frederick Pohl, Isaac Asimov. I'm Tony Schwartz. Hope you'll be back next time when we have another edition of Now in Paperback.